You've probably heard about the phenomenon known as the butterfly effect. A single, perhaps seemingly insignificant event can completely alter the future. But what if this event was deeply traumatic for one harmless teenager who dreamed of a happy future, and instead of becoming a respected individual, this teen, unexpectedly, transformed into a real monster? Could truly just one childhood event have such an impact on a person? Is the butterfly effect a fiction or a cruel reality? 10-year-old Justin suffered severe brain damage and was placed in a medically induced coma, but miraculously survived. His first words after regaining consciousness stunned the family members gathered around his bed. One evening in July 2004, a man and his 2 sons were digging a hole in the backyard. When one of the boys went inside, the father pointed Justin toward the horizon, trying to show him something. The moment the child looked away, a loud crash echoed through the yard. A large metal cattle grid fell onto Justin's head. On the way to the hospital, another horrific incident occurred. The father attempted to push the boy out of the moving car. What was this? A delusion from a teenager's fevered mind or a terrifying reality? In February 2003, a divorced woman named Lori McLeod, living with her daughter Casey, met a man named Scott Kimball. This happened in a small casino in Colorado. Lori spotted Scott playing cards, and when their eyes met, sparks flew between them. This man literally radiated a special sense of calm and protection. He was the kind of person you wanted to be around, and Lori trusted him. Kimball told his new acquaintance that he was an FBI agent, an outdoor enthusiast, and father of 2 sons. Lori was captivated by Scott from the first moments. He possessed incredible charisma, although physically he wasn't the ideal of male beauty. He simply treated Lori like a queen and was very kind to her daughter. Eventually, Scott moved into McLeod's house near Denver. By then, Casey was 19 years old and had recently struggled with dependency related to prohibited substances. However, by the time Scott settled in their home, the girl was clean. She made new friends and even got a job to get back on track and return to normal life. Everything was going well until one summer day in 2003 when Scott discovered a glass tube in Casey's room. He brought it to Lori, who knew exactly what it was, and a serious argument erupted between mother and daughter. The mother berated the girl for returning to old habits, while Casey fiercely denied that it was hers. She swore to her mother that she hadn't used the white powder in a long time, but Lori was terribly disappointed. She even threatened to call the police to forcibly send her daughter to a clinic for treatment, since she seemed unable to overcome the harmful dependency herself. The women exchanged hurtful phrases for a long time. Then Casey couldn't take it anymore, threw on her jacket, and simply left the house. At first, the mother, upset by her daughter's behavior, wasn't worried about her departure. It had happened before. But when Lori learned the next day that Casey hadn't shown up for work, she became uneasy, wondering if her daughter had really returned to what she had been fighting so desperately against in recent months. Lori couldn't reach Casey, and the police refused to file a missing person report since the girl was an adult and could travel somewhere independently without telling her mother. There were no suspicious circumstances in her disappearance. She had simply run away after arguing with Lori. Scott was hunting at the time, and the woman felt completely helpless. When Scott returned several days later, he reassured Lori that Casey would eventually come home. He also promised to talk to management and use his FBI connections if the girl didn't appear in the coming days. There were some signs that Scott was right about his missing stepdaughter. One day, he found one of her gold jewelry pieces hanging on a doorknob. A makeup kit had also vanished from her room. Apparently, Casey was living somewhere nearby and occasionally stopped by home to collect some belongings. She deliberately chose moments when her mother was at work. Scott also learned through his channels that Lori's daughter and her boyfriend had stayed at a motel room in Adams County. And a few days later, Casey herself wrote to her mother, apologized, and said she loved her. However, she never came back home. After that, no one heard anything more about the girl, and Lori continued searching for her daughter independently. She found her boyfriend, who said that he and Casey had stayed at a motel, and the last time he saw her was when Scott picked up his girlfriend to drive her to work. However, Scott claimed this was a blatant lie, and he hadn't seen his stepdaughter. The man swore he would do everything to find Lori's runaway daughter, but asked to give her time to cool off. And the woman accepted that Casey was an adult and had the right to choose her own life path. Scott felt he needed to support his loved ones somehow. He decided that pleasant experiences would be the best distraction and proposed to Lori. He told his future wife that he would take care of her and also track Casey's money movements to find out exactly where she was withdrawing cash from her account. At this stage, there was little that could be done, so Lori completely relied on Scott's experience. Shortly after Lori and Scott exchanged wedding vows in a Las Vegas chapel, they returned to Denver, where they took out life insurance policies. Lori named Scott as the sole beneficiary, because at that time she didn't know where her daughter was, or if she had gotten involved with prohibited substances again. Lori needed Scott and his support. He was the only hope of ever finding her daughter. However, days, weeks, and months went by, but nothing was heard about Casey. The couple moved outside Denver to start their own business. In the first year of marriage, there was tension between the spouses. Scott spent much time away from home, explaining it was due to his work, and often snapped at Lori when she pressed him with questions. Scott's sons from his first marriage, Justin and Cody, would sometimes visit their house. Lori noticed that the older son, 9-year-old Justin, who had a very gentle nature, often bore the brunt of his father's behavior. Scott considered gentleness a feminine trait and frequently called the boy Susie to express his disapproval. One evening in July 2004, Scott and the boys were digging a hole in the backyard. Everything was normal. Young Cody ran into the kitchen for water and rushed back outside. But seconds later, he burst back into the house screaming that his brother Justin was injured and they needed to call 911. Scott followed, carrying his son. He told Lori he would drive the child to the nearest hospital. He got in the truck and left. The woman grabbed Cody and followed her husband. When they reached the hospital, Justin lay on a gurney. His body was convulsing, and there was blood around him. A nurse explained that according to the father, first a heavy metal grid fell on Justin in the yard. Then, on the way to the hospital, the child tried to open the car window but accidentally hit the door handle and fell out at 60 miles per hour. This fall caused such severe trauma. No one believed Scott's older son would survive. After 2 weeks in an induced coma, Justin miraculously woke up. His first words were asking why Daddy did this to him. The boy claimed his father dropped the grid on him, then pushed him out of the moving car. After hearing the child, the treating physician suggested the injuries somehow affected brain function, and the boy saw the situation in a distorted way. Police conducted an investigation, but since both incidents occurred in different jurisdictions, it was unclear which department should take responsibility. To Justin's mother's horror, no charges were filed against Scott. The woman contacted her insurance office and removed her ex-husband's name from the beneficiaries list. Justin's life was protected by a $50,000 policy, and his sudden injuries made his mother think. The day before the incident, Scott had inquired about who was the beneficiary of Justin's life insurance policy. Now the mother feared her ex-husband had tried to take his own son's life to receive monetary payments. Soon after Scott's older son's accident, Scott's uncle, 60-year-old Terry Kimball, appeared at the family home. He brought a suitcase of cash withdrawn from his savings account. Lori strongly disliked the new relative. The man frequently drank, had a habit of walking around the house naked, and brought 2 dogs with him. The unkempt, heavy-set man evoked outright aversion in the woman. Uncle Terry came to stay with his nephew to start a joint business, and his presence could have lasted months or even years. However, fortunately for Lori, after staying with them for just a few weeks, the man suddenly disappeared. Scott told his wife an incredible story about how his Uncle Terry won the lottery and ran away with a stripper to Mexico, or perhaps even the Caribbean. The woman sighed with relief, but all these strange events somehow affected the couple's relationship. Lori and Scott began drifting apart. Lori even started suspecting Scott of infidelity. He would vanish from home for extended periods, and when he appeared, he explained his absence with the same work commitments. Despite problems in her personal life, Lori desperately searched for answers about her missing daughter Casey. By late 2005, Scott and Lori's marriage had practically fallen apart. The man was increasingly absent, showed less interest in searching for Casey, and made Lori feel she meant nothing to him. She suspected he was having an affair with a woman in California, where he frequently traveled. Around this same time, in early 2006, a few weeks after Uncle Terry's disappearance, the bank noticed suspicious activity on his credit card. The bank reported to police that fraudulent checks totaling about $80,000 were being cashed. The bank's security investigation led them to Scott Kimball. Police arrived at the farm where Lori and Scott lived and started asking questions. The ranch owner knew nothing about the money. She told officers that Terry Kimball won some lottery money and went to Mexico with a young girlfriend. She was surprised anyone could be interested in this heavy, untidy man, but money could compensate for all his negative traits. At one point, Lori casually mentioned that her daughter had been missing for about 2 years, and Scott was one of the last people to see her. Her suspicions about her husband had grown over time. The woman thought Scott might have given Casey money to disappear and not interfere with their relationship. Lori also told police that Scott worked for the FBI, and then the detectives investigating the bank fraud began thoroughly examining Scott's background and discovered many interesting things about him. Scott Lee Kimball was born September 21, 1966, in Boulder, Colorado. Little is known about his early years. When he was 10, his mother revealed to his father that she was gay. This led to divorce. Scott's father left the state and remarried. The separation deeply affected the boy. In early teens, he first broke the law by shooting neighborhood windows with his father's gun. Scott and his younger brother, Brett, temporarily lived in their grandmother's mobile home. Their neighbor, Theodore Payton, took advantage of the vulnerable teenager. First, he lured Scott into his house, posing as a friend, made him undress, and photographed him. Then, threatening to distribute the photos, he bound and assaulted the boy, recording it on video. The 41-year-old man threatened the inexperienced teenager that if he told anyone, his father in Montana would be harmed. This physical and psychological abuse continued whenever Scott visited Boulder on weekends from Hamilton, Montana, where he had moved with his younger brother to his father's new family and attended high school. The abuse only stopped when Scott turned 23. Unable to cope anymore, he shot himself in the head. The bullet caused minimal damage, but Scott spent several days in critical condition in intensive care. After this incident, he left the hospital a completely different person. Later, Scott and several other boys who were molested by their neighbor reported him to Boulder police. The man was arrested and jailed for child molestation. He received 7 years in prison. However, the trauma inflicted on Scott during adolescence impacted his entire life. At 22, Scott was convicted of check forgery. After serving time, he returned to Colorado, where he resumed breaking the law and robbing homes. Money, which he never had, was the only thing he truly loved. Scott's first marriage failed quickly. His second marriage, which produced 2 sons, couldn't be called happy either. His wife tired of Kimball's constant shady dealings and filed for divorce. Their relationship continued 2 years after separation, then ended completely when the woman accused Scott of sexual coercion. However, the man claimed she just wanted to interfere with his attempts to gain full custody of their sons. In 2000, violating probation for a previous fraud conviction, Kimball landed behind bars. A year later, he escaped custody and stole a cash truck at a gas station. Scott impersonated his brother for a while. He fled to Alaska to evade justice, even managing to marry and divorce under the false name. Eventually, he was caught and imprisoned. In federal prison, he convinced FBI agents to use him as an informant. Ultimately, some charges weren't filed since none of his previous arrests involved violent crimes. After release on bail in 2002, Scott moved in with his mother and her partner. He borrowed $65,000 from relatives to develop his business and started an organic beef company. However, this didn't mean he was reformed. His ex-wife also returned to Colorado. Though still afraid of Scott, she allowed him to see their sons. Police investigating the fraud case also learned Scott Kimball might be connected to another young woman's disappearance. Her name was Jennifer Lynn Markham. She vanished near Denver less than a year before Casey's disappearance. Jennifer, 25, was a single mother who worked as a dancer at an adult club. Her car was found at Denver Airport, but she never left the state, at least not by plane. The FBI was also involved in searching for Jennifer Markham, but the case stalled. They had a name of someone calling himself Joe Snitch. He contacted the Markham family by phone, offering to take the parents to mountains to show where Jennifer was buried. But he demanded the trip be kept secret from police. The parents worried another scammer wanted to profit from their grief. They feared going to mountains with a stranger and doubted he had anything real to show. They suspected he might take their money and dispose of them, perhaps by pushing them off a cliff. When detectives visited the Markham family, the parents told them about the strange man named Joe Snitch and suspected he might be involved in Jennifer's disappearance. How else would he know specific details about her death? Fortunately, police didn't need long to discover Joe's real identity. Thus, an investigation that began with fraudulent bank checks turned into a search for two missing young women, Casey McLeod and Jennifer Markham, and it all connected to one person, Scott Kimball, aka Joe Snitch. After that, the detectives stumbled upon a peculiar accident from 2004 involving Kimball's 10-year-old son, Justin. The investigator grew suspicious about whether it was truly accidental, as the child, upon regaining consciousness, claimed his father was responsible for his injuries. No one had seen Scott's 60-year-old uncle Terry Kimball since he allegedly won the lottery and left the United States with his mistress. Lori told officers that one day she returned home from work to find the furniture rearranged. Scott had removed a white leather couch with a noticeable stain from the room. When Lori inquired about the stain, Scott explained that one of his uncle's dogs had vomited on the couch. Terry had departed, so Scott simply wanted to dispose of the damaged furniture. By March 2006, police had compiled a list of questions for Scott, ranging from counterfeit checks to the attempted murder of his own son. An arrest warrant was issued, but Scott couldn't be located anywhere. He called Lori from Alaska and even sent photographs. However, when detectives traced the call, it originated from a residential house in California. On March 14, 2006, when police arrived to arrest Scott after 2 months, they became involved in a high-speed pursuit lasting several hours. The chase only ended when Scott's truck ran out of gas and stopped in a field. Yet even then, the man continued testing the officer's patience. Initially, he refused to exit the vehicle, fearing he would be shot immediately. After extended negotiations, Scott decided to surrender. He was finally arrested. But how could Scott commit all these crimes while practically under the police's nose the entire time? Scott's criminal life began when he turned 18. By age 40, he had accumulated 10 convictions, though none involved violent offenses. FBI agents, for whom Scott served as an informant for a period, never imagined he was capable of violent retribution. Scott served time in Colorado, Montana, Washington, and Alaska for theft, fraud, document forgery, and various other crimes. He was technically accused of abducting his former wife. However, these charges were dismissed. Scott served as a key witness in several FBI investigations. These included a planned assault on a judge in Alaska, an attack on a lawyer's assistant in Seattle, and a federal arson case in Montana. Before meeting Lori McLeod Kimball, while imprisoned for fraud, disclosed information about an impending crime. He shared this information in exchange for a cooperation agreement as a paid informant and a reduced prison sentence. Subsequently, Scott befriended another inmate who was plotting to take the life of a female witness in the case. This was Jennifer Markham. After his release from prison in 2003, shortly before meeting his future wife, Lori, Kimball began monitoring Jennifer under FBI orders. The young woman was scheduled to testify in court regarding an illicit substance distribution network. Later, it was revealed that no elimination plan existed. Scott had been continuously deceiving the FBI. Almost all information he provided to the Bureau proved useless for investigating other crimes. Most of it subsequently turned out to be fabricated. Yet agents somehow continued believing Scott was incapable of taking a life. The situation might have remained unresolved if Jennifer Markham's and Casey McLeod's fathers hadn't gone to the police station demanding answers. Only then did authorities become more active and treat the disappearances of the young women more seriously, considering that Joe's snitch might have been far worse than initially thought. Police quickly determined that Uncle Terry never won any lottery and had also vanished. There was no evidence the man had ever left the state, let alone moved to another country. FBI agents seized Scott's computer and discovered photos of deceased women who had been tortured. One photo on the laptop that particularly disturbed officers showed a young woman who didn't appear distressed, just smiling. They suspected this could be another potential victim they didn't know about. Finally, Scott was called in for questioning to try piecing everything together. The detainee denied everything. He insisted that if his Uncle Terry hadn't left the country, he must be enjoying life somewhere in the United States. As for the girl's whereabouts, he claimed complete ignorance. In short, the conversation with Scott provided officers no new information. At that point, detectives decided to speak with his former cellmates. A man named Stephen Hawley, serving life, confessed that he and Scott had planned an escape. Once free, Scott was supposed to drive his truck to the prison wall and throw over a ladder for Stephen to climb across while other inmates created a diversion. Afterward, the former cellmates planned to flee toward Mexico. When Scott was released, he visited Stephen in prison and requested his girlfriend's contact information, allegedly to assist with the escape plan. Scott asked to be called Hannibal as a cover. Stephen called his girlfriend and told her someone named Hannibal would contact her. The girl was Leanne Emery. She was a 24-year-old Idaho native. Emery was diagnosed with bipolar disorder as a teenager and had recently worked as an adult dancer. After meeting Scott, Emery became involved in his check fraud schemes, unable to communicate with Steve Hawley, who was now in solitary confinement with no phone privileges. She grew increasingly dependent on Scott. This turned into the biggest tragedy for Stephen. When FBI agents tried to meet her, they discovered Emery had also vanished. She was last seen near Denver in early 2003. Her car was discovered abandoned in Utah. Emails to relatives indicated she was traveling with someone called Hannibal. It was her photo they found on Scott's computer. Now police had another name and another missing person somehow connected to Scott. Then it became clear to FBI agents that Scott Lee Kimball, their former informant, might be not just a fraudster and forger, but a serial offender who somehow disposed of unwanted individuals right under police surveillance. Detectives returned to Lori's farm. Among Scott's belongings left at Lori's house, they found a store receipt dated the day 19-year-old Casey McLeod was last seen. The store was located near a national park. During another interrogation, when detectives inquired about what happened to his stepdaughter Casey, Scott initially tried to evade answering. Then he shared a story officers hadn't heard before. According to Scott, the girl died from an overdose, possibly somewhere in the Route Wilderness area. FBI agents went to the national park to verify Scott's statement. Rangers told them a hunter had recently discovered a human skull that apparently belonged to a young woman. Subsequent DNA analysis confirmed it was Casey McLeod's skull. Having evidence that at least one missing person last seen with Scott was actually dead, detectives could pressure him. Scott was offered a plea deal. He had to plead guilty and reveal the locations of 3 other bodies: Leanne Emery, Jennifer Markham, and Terry Kimball. Otherwise, he could face the death penalty. Scott naturally accepted the deal, realizing he couldn't evade it. With law enforcement, he traveled to Utah and indicated Leanne Emery's body location. Scott revealed he took the girl to Bryce Canyon in Utah. After climbing a cliff, he made Emery kneel on a rock, then shot her in the head with a gun she had bought for him days earlier during their check fraud scheme. Her parents weren't immediately concerned about their daughter's disappearance, since she had told them she wanted to go to Mexico for spelunking, her hobby. Her mother and father were happy, hoping she would get her life back on track. When the girl stopped communicating, the family grew worried and filed a missing person report, but authorities were slow to search since Emery was an adult, capable of independence. Through their daughter's credit card records, the parents learned she never actually went to Mexico. A cousin, who spoke with Emery before her disappearance, revealed she had been traveling with someone called Hannibal, whom she feared. However, police remained largely uninterested in the case until the FBI began investigating the girl's disappearance. Jennifer Markham's body was never found. The offender admitted he couldn't remember where he left it. They met 2 weeks after Scott's prison release. He was supposed to monitor her as she was a key witness. Kimball told her he owned several coffee shops in Seattle and invited Jennifer to manage one of them. Jennifer agreed. She moved her belongings to Scott's place, and the next day, their mobile phones were turned off. Scott reappeared 3 days later, but Jennifer's phone never turned on again. Terry Kimball's body, Scott's uncle, was found at his nephew's direction on a mountain in Colorado. Scott simply took the cash his relative brought for their joint business, then disposed of its owner. Since only 2 victims' bodies were found out of the remaining 3, the plea deal fell through. However, Scott still pleaded guilty to all 4 killings and received 70 years imprisonment. He was already serving a 48-year prison term for fraud. At trial, Scott blamed the FBI for pushing him into a criminal world more dangerous than anything he'd encountered before. After sentencing, prosecutors and investigators told media they believed the 4 deaths Scott confessed to weren't his only violent crimes. In prison, Scott bragged to other inmates about taking dozens of lives. Though exaggerating, his boasts might have held some truth. The speed and ease with which Scott dispatched unwanted individuals suggested prior experience. It's worth noting his 4 victims were vulnerable people from society's margins, whose disappearances wouldn't be immediately noticed. They engaged in theft and fraud, struggled with substance abuse, and were somewhat social outcasts. Scott was linked to other violent cases. Katrina Powell, whose lifestyle closely resembled Scott's other victims, was found dead in suburban Denver around the time Scott lived there. He confessed to another inmate about taking her life, though he never mentioned this to authorities. In fact, Scott is believed to potentially be responsible for more than 24 missing persons. Theodore Payton, the man who essentially deprived teenage Scott of a normal childhood, died in January 2017. His body was found near a cabin in the Netherlands. Heart disease was the cause of death. Payton served 5 years of his 7-year sentence after Scott and other victims testified. Nevertheless, memories of childhood humiliation haunted Scott throughout his life. He still bore the scar on his forehead, from that unsuccessful attempt to end his shame forever. Had this person not crossed Scott's path, perhaps his life would have turned out differently. You've likely heard of the butterfly effect phenomenon. One seemingly insignificant event can completely alter the future. What if that event was deeply traumatic for a harmless teenager who dreamed of a happy future?